The silence of my room in Isfahan in the early hours of that March morning was very heavy. It felt like I could feel the weight of the air against my chest. I had always been a man of certainties, or at least I pretended to be while climbing the career ladder within IRGC intelligence. Being the son of an important Ayatollah in Qom was not just a family matter. It was like a path that was already prepared for me before I even knew how to read properly. I grew up surrounded by religion, memorizing verses while other boys played in the street, and I saw my mother's pride as a burden I had to carry all the time. But that night, I felt something strange. There was a tension in the air, a weight that had nothing to do with my work or the things I believed in. I kept staring at the ceiling, cold sweat dripping down, never imagining that the life I had built was about to end because of a presence I had tried to erase from Iran my entire life. I was alone and felt a void that no prayer could solve. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell so you don't miss any testimonies, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from. It is very important to have you participating in this community. Now let's get back to the testimony. I spent 32 years being the perfect son for my religion. My hands, which were sweating cold now, had already signed many arrest orders and conducted difficult interrogations with people we called traitors for following Christianity. I truly believed that each of them was an enemy of Iran and of the faith my father preached on television. I studied Islamic laws with all the dedication in the world, but it wasn't out of love. It was only out of obligation. Inside, I felt dry, empty, and I always wondered why. After so many prayers and so many fasts during Ramadan, I never felt anything real. I only felt the weight of the rules. I was trained to find any sign of rebellion in others, but I couldn't see that I myself was desperate for something that made sense, something that wasn't just fear or politics. I watched everyone, but my own life was falling apart inside, and I had no idea that everything was going to change radically at 3:47 that morning. The clock by the bed read 3:47 when I suddenly woke up. I didn't hear any noise, but the air in the room felt different, heavier, as if something were there with me. My heart started beating very fast and I felt a strange tingling in my arms, a kind of shiver I had never felt before in my life. I tried to move, but it felt like I was glued to the bed, unable to lift a finger. That was when I saw a light starting in the corner of the room, near the shelf where I kept my workbooks and the Quran. At first it was faint, looking like the reflection of a car outside, but it soon became very strong and clear. It wasn't an ordinary light, like a lamp. It was a glow that came from within the air itself, something white and very pure that illuminated everything, but without stinging the eyes. I was afraid, thinking someone had broken into my apartment, but the door and window remained locked. I wasn't alone, but it wasn't an enemy who was there. It was something I never imagined witnessing. And in the center of that unbearable light, he appeared. It wasn't a blurred vision or a dream of someone tired. It was a real man, there, dressed in a white robe that shone brightly, something I can't even describe properly. The authority he projected was so strong that my whole body shook instantly, and my mind, which was always trained to be rational and cold, simply froze. The room, which before had made me afraid, became filled with a feeling of love so heavy and real that my barriers as an intelligence officer vanished. He looked right into my eyes, and I felt that he knew everything, every interrogation I did, every lie, every bad thing I kept. Then he spoke my name, Abdul Hussein, in perfect Farsi. His voice was firm and gentle, as if he had known me since I was born. It wasn't judgment, it was an invitation. At that exact moment, the weight of 32 years following empty rules and trying to please a God I didn't know vanished. He was there for me. I stayed paralyzed, on my knees on the cold floor, while those words echoed inside my soul in a way I couldn't explain. He said he was the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one would reach the Father if it weren't for him. That wasn't just a phrase I had heard in interrogation reports. It was as if each word had a physical weight, an authority that dismantled all my theology and everything I had learned in school in Qom. He spoke of an eternal love, of a search he himself was making for me, and I felt small, almost invisible before such purity. The Farsi he used was so perfect, so intimate, that it seemed he had created the language just to speak to me at that moment. I, who had always used words to accuse and condemn people, was now being disarmed by a voice that only offered peace. I wanted to disappear and, at the same time, I wanted to stay there forever, immersed in that light that seemed to be cleaning every dirty corner of my memory. While he spoke, my mind began to project, like a horror movie, all the faces of the Christians I had persecuted and interrogated. I remembered Hussein, that former officer I sent to execution, and the calm way he looked at me in the cold intelligence room. I remembered Zara, the girl who lost her family, and so many others I treated like trash. In the presence of that light, I felt like an old dirty rag, ashamed to anything that could be called sacred. How could I have been so blind? I thought I was serving God by persecuting these people, but now I saw that I was fighting against God himself. The weight of my sin was so great that I could barely breathe, and I began to cry a cry that came from deep within, a sob that felt like it was going to break my ribs. I didn't deserve to be there. I didn't even deserve for him to know my name, let alone speak to me with such tenderness and compassion. I was the very enemy of the light. But then, in the midst of my despair and shame, he said something that changed my world in a way my father never could in 32 years. He called me beloved son. Those two words entered my heart like a balm I didn't even know I needed. My father, Ayatollah Mohammed Hussein, was always a man of ice and rules. He called me obedient, useful, a good officer, but never beloved. The love my father gave me was always conditioned on my performance, my loyalty to the regime, and my religious discipline. But Jesus was calling me son without me having done anything to deserve it, even after I had done everything to destroy what was his. I realized there that my whole life I had been a slave trying to earn the favor of a master, but now I was before a father who had already accepted me even before I asked for forgiveness. It was such a profound shock of identity that I felt as if I were being born again on that carpeted floor. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light began to dim, and his presence grew softer until the room became dark again. I stayed there, kneeling, with my face pressed against the rug, without the courage to move for a long time. The silence now was different. It was no longer that heavy void. It was a silence full of a peace I never imagined existed in the world. I looked at the clock and it was still just after 4 in the morning. The world outside, in Isfahan, remained the same, with revolutionary guards patrolling and the regime functioning, but I knew I would never be the same man again. I was an intelligence officer who had just found the target I was supposed to destroy, and that target had saved me. I was shaking, with my eyes swollen from crying so much, but I felt a new strength, a kind of courage that didn't come from my military training. I didn't know what would happen when the sun rose, but I knew that now I belonged to him. When the sun began to brighten the window of my room in Isfahan, I felt like a stranger inside my own house. Every object, from the Revolutionary Guard uniform hanging in the closet to the books of Islamic theology, now seemed to belong to a life that was no longer mine. I had to look in the mirror and try to compose that mask of a cold and dedicated officer, but my eyes were different, shining with a hope that I needed to hide at all costs. I went out to work with my heart in my mouth, afraid that any intelligence colleague could read my soul or smell that supernatural peace that still enveloped me. At the barracks, every greeting and every report on enemies of the state now sounded like a stab to my chest. I was living a lie out of necessity, pretending to be the hunter while I had become the most precious prey of all. The tension of hiding that light in such a dark place was almost unbearable, but I knew I couldn't just speak. I needed help urgently. I spent the whole day at my desk at the barracks, but my mind was not on the surveillance reports or the maps of operations. I was trying to remember every technical detail I had read in the secret files about how Christians hid. I knew the names of the encrypted apps, the keywords they used to identify themselves, and the forums where they sought help. It was a terrible irony to realize that the training I received to destroy the underground church was now my only escape map to find it. When I got home that night, I locked all the doors and checked for any listening devices, a habit I had because of my position, but which now served to protect my new secret. With trembling hands, I downloaded one of those apps on my personal cell phone and began typing a simple message in a group I knew was monitored by my own division. I knew the risks, knew it could be a trap, but the thirst I had was greater than the fear. The message I sent was short. My name is Hussein. I am in Isfahan. I am a new believer, and I need help. After I hit the send button, the silence of my apartment seemed to get even louder. Every second of waiting was psychological torture. I kept looking at the cell phone screen, my heart beating in my throat, wondering if on the other side would be a true brother in Christ or a colleague of mine from intelligence ready to track my IP and arrest me for apostasy. I had seen this happen dozens of times. We created fake profiles just to lure those who were seeking the truth. But I felt something different. a calm that told me not to delete the message. 5 minutes later, the cell phone vibrated and a response appeared. "Brother, welcome to the family of God. We were waiting for you. You are no longer alone." Those words on the screen hit me like an electric shock. They didn't treat me with suspicion, but with a welcome I never received even within the IRGC. I replied asking how they could trust me so quickly, since I was a high-ranking officer and a huge risk to any clandestine network. The answer that came next made me break into tears again, right there, sitting on the edge of my bed. They said they knew exactly who I was, and that Hussein, the former officer I had sent to execution months earlier, had asked the prayer network to intercede for me by name before he died. He had told the other believers, through secret notes in prison, that I was under strong conviction of the Spirit, and that Jesus was going to reach me. Knowing that the man I helped kill had used his last moments of life to pray for my salvation was something that broke the last defenses of my pride. I was the fruit of my own prisoner's prayers. That love was not of this world. It was the love of Jesus acting through the people I hated most. They gave me a secret address and a knocking code for a meeting. I walked through the narrow alleys of the Naqshi Jahan neighborhood in Isfahan, feeling that every shadow projected on the adobe walls was a pair of intelligence eyes watching me. I used all my counter-surveillance training, the same I taught to so many recruits, to ensure no one was following me. I turned unnecessary corners, stopped in front of empty shop windows to check the street's reflection, and kept my head down under my hood, my heart hammering against my ribs in a way I thought anyone could hear. The contrast was brutal. I was using the tactics of a regime hunter to protect my meeting with the people I was ordered to destroy. Finally, I found the indicated building, a modest, peeling construction that wouldn't catch anyone's attention. I climbed the concrete steps with heavy legs, feeling that each step took me further away from my old life. I stopped in front of door number 7, took a deep breath, and gave the signal. 3 dry knocks, a short pause, and then 2 light knocks. The silence that followed felt like an eternity of judgment. When the door opened just a crack, I saw the cautious look of a young woman, but as soon as she recognized something in me, perhaps the same mark of desperation and searching everyone there shared, she smiled and let me in quickly. The apartment was small, with the comforting smell of tea and fresh bread, and there were about 12 people sitting in a circle on cushions on the floor. The air inside was different from anything I had ever experienced at IRGC headquarters, or even in the great luxury mosques. There was no coldness of power or rigidity of surveillance, but an atmosphere of acceptance that almost made me collapse right at the entrance. An older man, with kind eyes and calloused hands, stood up and came toward me. He didn't ask for my credentials or my service history. He simply wrapped me in a tight hug, a fatherly hug I never received at home. "My name is Cyrus," he whispered near my ear. "We are your family now, Abdul. Welcome home, my brother." At that moment, I knew I was no longer an intelligence officer. I was just a son who had finally found his place. After the introductions, Cyrus sat beside me and took from a small bag an object that, in any other context of my life, would be considered evidence of a crime against the state. It was a New Testament in Farsi, with yellowed edges and a cover worn from constant use. My hands, the same hands that had already confiscated and thrown away so many books like that into evidence bags to be destroyed, now trembled as I touched the texture of those pages. Holding that book was like holding a forbidden relic that contained the secret of my existence. When I opened to the Gospel of Matthew, the words seemed to jump off the paper with a life of their own, as if Jesus were breathing each verse directly into me. I read about his birth and the beginning of a kingdom that was not based on armies, but on spirit and truth. Every sentence I read filled a piece of the void that had existed in my chest for years. I couldn't stop looking at those letters, feeling that they were the only firm ground beneath my feet. Cyrus began to talk about the meaning of being born again, explaining that our faith was not a collection of rules to try to convince God to love us, but a response to the love he had already poured out for us on the cross. He said that in Islam, we were taught to be slaves of Allah, always working and never having absolute certainty that we had done enough to be accepted in judgment. But in Jesus, slavery had ended. We were children, loved unconditionally, and forgiven for what he did. That truth was like a hammer breaking the chains that bound my soul. I spent my whole life trying to be the best Muslim, the best officer, dying of fear of failing and being discarded. But there, in that humble room, I understood that I could finally rest. I no longer needed to fight to be accepted, because the King of the universe had already called me his. My identity as an officer was dying, and a new man was emerging there. As I listened to the others share, I realized that my experience was not an isolated delusion or a weakness of my tired mind. Every person there had an invisible scar, but a glow in their eyes that no torture by the regime could erase. There was a nurse from Mashhad, a student from Tehran, and a worker from Shiraz, and they all told the same thing. The man in white, the voice speaking in Farsi, the love that disarmed any resistance. I felt constant shivers running down my arms and back as they spoke. It was as if the room were charged with a soft electricity that kept me alert and at the same time at peace. I looked at those calloused hands and those common faces, people I would have arrested without hesitation last week, and now I felt a connection with them that was stronger than blood. I was beginning to understand that what was happening in Iran was something no intelligence service could predict or contain, because it was happening inside hearts, in places where the state's eyes cannot reach. One of the young men, named Javad, told me he had been from the Basij militia, patrolling the streets of Isfahan to ensure Islamic morality was enforced by force. He told me he had already arrested women for poorly placed hijabs and raided parties to confiscate forbidden music. When he told me this, I felt a lump in my throat because I saw in him the reflection of what I myself was. He looked into my eyes and said that Jesus appeared to him in a dream and asked why he was burdening the people with rules he had never given. Javad dropped everything, left the militia, and was now there, risking his life to read the gospel with me. The two of us, who before were the armed arms of fear, were now sitting side by side, crying like children who had just been forgiven for a serious mischief. The irony of that scene was almost unbearable. Two men trained for hatred being rebuilt by love. I felt a heat in my chest that seemed to melt all the coldness I cultivated for years in IRGC intelligence, and that made me feel human again. The return to the barracks the next morning was one of the most suffocating experiences of my life. I entered the intelligence building and the smell of strong coffee and the sound of printers seemed aggressive, as if every noise were accusing me of treason. I had to sit at my desk and review surveillance reports on subversive activities, knowing that I was now the primary target of those same activities. The hypocrisy of writing recommendations for criminal proceedings against Christians while I hid my New Testament in a locked drawer gave me physical nausea. I tried to do the 5 daily prayers facing Mecca so as not to raise suspicions, but the words died in my mouth. I could no longer repeat the memorized formulas when my heart only wanted to scream the name of Jesus. I felt like a diver running out of oxygen, trying to stay calm as the water pressure increased every minute. I knew I was living on borrowed time, and that at any moment the mask could fall, but the peace I felt in my room, that early morning, was still what sustained me. In the middle of that tense week, my cell phone rang and I saw my father's name on the screen. My heart raced. Answering Ayatollah Muhammad Hussein was not just answering a father, it was answering a religious authority who decided fates. His voice was cold, demanding that I go to the family home in Qom for Friday prayers, saying my mother missed me. I gripped the device so hard my knuckles turned white. I had to invent a lie, saying I had urgent intelligence operations in Isfahan and couldn't leave. I felt physical pain lying to the man who raised me, but I knew if I went to Qom now, he would see the change in my face. He is a master at reading people's intentions, and I no longer had the protection of my own coldness to hide. I hung up the phone with my hand shaking, feeling that the abyss between us was becoming too wide to be crossed. I was losing my earthly father, but I was gaining a heavenly Father who loved me without conditions. The moment the ground disappeared beneath my feet happened on an August afternoon inside the meeting room of the intelligence headquarters, where the smell of cheap cigarettes and old coffee seemed more suffocating than usual. My commander, a man with a lined face and eyes that never blinked, opened a folder on the dark wood table and began pointing to several addresses on a map of Isfahan. He spoke with cold excitement about a network of apostates they had been monitoring for months through an infiltrated informant. My blood ran cold, and I felt a cold sweat running down my spine when he mentioned that the group had more than 40 members and that the final blow would be struck simultaneously in 5 different locations. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my heart beat so hard I was sure he could hear it. When he circled the address in the Naqshi Jahan neighborhood and said, "Apartment number 7, I felt a physical nausea so strong that I had to dig my nails into my palm to not show the terror consuming me. It was them. It was my family. I left the meeting with my mind in a whirlwind and locked myself in one of the bathroom stalls, leaning my forehead against the cold tile to try to organize my thoughts. I was the officer designated to lead the raid at that exact location. The regime I served my whole life was asking me to arrest the very people who had taught me what love and grace were. The dilemma was agonizing. If I did my job, I would send my brothers to torture or death. If I warned them and they fled, the IRGC would immediately know there was a leak, and the investigation would reach me in a matter of hours. I was shaking so much I could barely stand. But then, in the midst of that panic, I remembered the peace I felt on the morning Jesus appeared in my room. I understood that he hadn't saved me just for me to hide, but so that I would be a protector. I no longer belonged to the IRGC, I belonged to the kingdom of God. I knew that if I died to save them, my life would finally have had a real purpose. The decision was made, even if it was my end. The night I sent the warning was the longest of my life, a nightmare of anxiety and whispered prayers in the dark of my apartment. I used a burner phone and public Wi-Fi, far from my house, to access the Signal app and send a short and urgent message to Cyrus. I typed with trembling fingers, warning about the date of the operation, the locations, and the existence of the informant. I told them to disappear, burn any evidence, and leave no trace because the regime was coming with full force. When I hit the send button, it was as if I were signing my own death warrant, but at the same time, a supernatural, almost strange calm took over me. I had nothing more to lose. I had handed everything into Jesus' hands. I spent the rest of the night staring at the wall, wondering if they would have time to flee or if I would be arrested before the sun even rose. Every noise in the building hallway made me jump, thinking it was my colleagues coming to get me for my own interrogation. September 5th arrived like an omen of a storm. I was there, in uniform and armed, leading the team up the stairs of the building in Nakshi Jahan. I felt a horrible weight in my stomach as we set up the tactical perimeter. When we broke down the door to apartment number 7 with a violent kick, my heart almost stopped. The silence that greeted us was the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. The place was completely empty. There were no people, no Bibles. There was nothing but the cushions on the floor. My commander, who was monitoring the operation via radio from another location, began shouting orders and curses when the reports from the other 4 raids arrived. All empty. He was furious, screaming that it was impossible and that someone had betrayed us. I played my role as a confused officer, turning over empty drawers, but inside I was praising God with every breath. But when I looked to the side and saw the look of suspicion from one of my subordinates, I realized the investigation would start right there. Time was running out for me. On the morning after the operation's failure, the intelligence barracks felt like a nest of enraged wasps. I was called to my commander's office early, and the atmosphere inside was so cold I felt my breath almost condense in the air. He wasn't screaming. He was worse. He was in absolute silence, just tapping a metal pen against the desktop while staring at me with eyes that looked like ice knives. He said that 5 coordinated raids failing at the same time was not a coincidence. It was systematic treason. The weight of that word, treason, echoed on the walls like a sentence. I tried to maintain the posture I trained for years, with a straight spine and expressionless face, but every tap of that pen felt like a stopwatch counting down the minutes of freedom I had left. He began to detail how the internal investigation would be brutal and that no one was above suspicion, especially those who had total access to the plans. I saw the flash of an old distrust in his eyes, a realization that I was no longer the same man he trained. The hunter was now being measured for slaughter. The moment of suspension felt as if they had torn off my very skin. The commander demanded that I hand over my weapon, my credentials, and my access to the intelligence systems. When I placed the cold metal of the pistol on the table, I felt a physical vulnerability I had never experienced before. Without that badge and without that uniform, I was no one in Iran. I was just a body waiting to be arrested. He gave me direct orders not to leave Isfahan and said I would be under constant surveillance while the digital audit of my devices was performed. I left that office feeling the weight of every guard's gaze in the corridors, as if everyone already knew my secret. The irony was that, although I was technically disarmed and under suspicion, I had never felt so spiritually strong. I had lost the protection of an earthly regime, but I was under the guard of a kingdom they couldn't even begin to comprehend. My life as an officer ended there, at that counter, and now my journey as a fugitive for love of Christ began. I arrived at my apartment and locked the door with hands so shaky the key almost fell to the floor. I knew surveillance would be outside, hidden in some ordinary car on the street, watching my every move. With my heart in my mouth, I took the cell phone I had hidden and sent the final message to Cyrus. I need to leave Iran now. They know. Can you help me? The response came like a breath of life in a desert. Bring nothing. Bring only yourself and your documents. Be ready at midnight. Someone will come to pick you up. I looked around my room, at my books, at photos of my family, and realized I was leaving everything I knew behind. I was going to become a ghost in my own country. I prayed desperately, asking Jesus to give me courage not to look back, like Lot's wife. The loneliness of those hours of waiting was overwhelming, a silence that was only broken by the sound of my own short breathing. I was abandoning a life of power and influence to embrace the unknown, moved only by a voice that called me beloved son in the dark. Exactly at 11:45 p.m., I heard 3 almost imperceptible knocks on my door. When I opened it, a man I had never seen, in simple clothes and with watchful eyes, just signaled for me to follow him. I left my apartment without taking a single extra piece of clothing, only my ID and the certainty that Jesus was in the back seat of that journey. We went down the stairs in absolute silence and got into a car waiting with the engine running. As we crossed the dark streets of Isfahan, I looked out the window at the monuments, the illuminated mosques, and the Zayanderud River, knowing I would probably never see my homeland again. The pain of knowing my father would hate me, and my mother would cry for a son they would consider dead, was like an open wound. But at the same time, as we moved away from the city lights toward the south, I felt a freedom that didn't depend on passports or government permissions. I was fleeing to life. The Iran I served was being left behind, and the God I had found was leading me to a place where I could finally shout his name without fear. The trip to the farm on the outskirts of Shiraz lasted hours that felt like days, in a silence only broken by the sound of the engine and the beats of my own heart. When we finally arrived at an isolated building, hidden by trees and shadows, I was taken inside and found 3 other people who, like me, were leaving everything behind because of Jesus. It was an unlikely group, a pastor from Tehran whose church had been closed, a young woman from Mashhad who was almost killed by her own family after conversion, and an ex-Muslim from Qom who knew the laws as well as I did. Looking at them was like looking in the mirror of a new reality. We were no longer officers, students, or leaders. We were just fugitives united by a vision and a hope the regime tried to stifle. The atmosphere in that house was one of fear mixed with deep peace, something I couldn't logically explain. We were all exhausted, with eyes red from sleep and crying, but there was a quiet dignity in each one, as if we were participating in something much bigger than our own lives. A woman named Nasarine, who seemed to coordinate that escape route, gathered us in a corner of the room and gave us instructions that sounded like a final goodbye to our homeland. She handed us a small bag with water and dried fruit, telling us to take nothing else but that and our documents, as the climb through the mountains would be brutal and every extra gram could mean failure. She looked deep into my eyes and said, "Jesus will provide what you need on the other side. Leave Iran behind. The Lord is ahead." Those words echoed in me as we prepared for the most dangerous part of the journey. We prayed together, whispering in Farsi, asking for protection against the border patrols that I myself, at another time, would have helped coordinate. It was a sharp irony knowing that the guards now hunting us were my former brothers in arms. We left that house in the middle of the night, entering the back of a truck covered by a tarp, feeling the mountain cold begin to bite our skin. I held my New Testament against my chest, feeling that book was the only real thing I had left in the world. The crossing on foot through the mountains was the greatest physical challenge I have ever faced, a pain that seemed to want to dissolve my muscles with every step on the loose stones. The guide, a Kurdish man who knew every crevice of that region, led us in absolute silence, communicating only by hand signals. My lungs burned with the thin air, and the early morning cold was so intense that I could no longer feel the tips of my fingers. At one critical moment, the guide hissed, "Get down!" and we all threw ourselves onto the ground, camouflaged by the darkness. I saw the lights of a border patrol moving along the mountain ridge, just a few meters from where we were hidden. In that instant, lying on the frozen earth, I felt the terror of being captured and taken back to the interrogation cells I knew so well. I prayed in silence, crying out to the name of Jesus, feeling that supernatural peace envelop me again, even with the danger so close. The lights moved away and we continued to climb, step by step, in a constant struggle against fatigue and gravity, moved only by the promise that there was real freedom waiting for us on the other side of that peak. When the first light of dawn began to illuminate the snowy peaks, the guide stopped and pointed to a village stretching out in the valley below. "That is Turkey," he said, in a hoarse and brief voice. "Follow that path to the church. They are waiting for you." He said goodbye without many words and disappeared back into the mountain shadows, leaving us alone at the borderline. We went down the slope stumbling, with torn clothes and faces covered in dust, but with a joy that overflowed in the form of silent tears. We reached the village and knocked on the door of a small stone church. When a Turkish pastor opened the door and saw us in that state, he didn't need explanations. He opened his arms and said, in broken Farsi, "Come, you are safe now. Welcome to freedom." Entering that church, feeling the warmth of the environment, and hearing the sound of the door closing behind us was the moment it finally sank in. I had left the system of fear behind. I was free to worship my Lord without needing to hide in the shadows of Isfahan. The days I spent at the processing center in Istanbul were marked by a fatigue that seemed to have settled in my soul, but also by a fellowship I never imagined finding. I shared a cramped room with 6 other men, sleeping on thin mattresses on the floor and eating lentils every day. But there I met the true face of the church I once persecuted. Everyone had a story that was a mirror of mine. Dreams of the man in white, miraculous healings, and a desperate escape. I heard accounts of people who were tortured in Evin prison, and who, even with the marks on their bodies, smiled when speaking of Jesus. That gave me a strength no military training could give. When I finally received the news that my asylum in Germany had been approved and that a church in Heidelberg would sponsor me, I felt a mix of relief and profound sadness for leaving my region behind. The flight to Frankfurt was the first time I left my country, and seeing the lights of Europe through the window made me realize the world was much bigger than the system I lived in for 32 years. Arriving in my small apartment in Heidelberg and finding a Farsi Bible on the table was God's final hug on that journey of escape. The first 6 months in Germany were a period of healing and a necessary silence, but also of a constant struggle not to be carried away by the guilt of what I left behind. I spent 5 days a week studying German, trying to make my tongue adapt to sounds that seemed from another planet, while attending counseling sessions to deal with the trauma of persecution and flight. I found a community of Iranian believers in Heidelberg, and for the first time in my life, I could sing praises in Farsi without needing to look over my shoulder or lower the radio volume. But inside, the weight of my story would not leave me in peace. I thought of Cyrus, Miriam, and the others still operating in the shadows in Isfahan. I felt that Jesus hadn't plucked me from the heart of IRGC intelligence just for me to live a safe and comfortable life in Europe. The voice that called me by name that morning still echoed, reminding me that I was a witness to something the world needed to hear. I saw news about persecution in Iran, and my chest burned with the desire to tell each of those officers that they were fighting against the Creator himself. In March 2025, exactly 1 year after the visit that changed everything in my room in Isfahan, I was approached by a ministry that records testimonies of Iranians to be broadcast via satellite and internet. They asked me if I was willing to show my face and tell my story to the world. I hesitated for many days, feeling a dread I knew well. I knew if I did that, my father would publicly disown me, the regime would put a bounty on my head, and I would never be able to hug my mother again. It was the final sacrifice of everything I still had linking me to my past. But while I prayed, I remembered Hussein, the man I prayed would be executed and who used his last words to ask for me. If he gave his life so that I would know the truth, who was I to hide out of fear? I felt a peace telling me that my silence was the only thing still binding me to the regime. I decided it was time to let the light shine, regardless of the price the Tehran government tried to charge me for it. I no longer belonged to myself. I was a messenger of the king. The day of recording at the studio in Heidelberg was like a ritual of definitive liberation. I sat before those cameras, under the bright lights that reminded me of the glow of that early morning, and took a deep breath to begin speaking. At first, my voice failed when mentioning my father's name and the authority I exercised in the IRGC, but as I moved forward in the account of Jesus' appearance, I felt a supernatural strength taking over my words. I looked directly into the lens and spoke to my former intelligence colleagues, the mullahs, and every Iranian living in the void I lived in for decades. I said Jesus was walking the streets of Tehran and Isfahan, entering locked rooms and tearing down the walls of fear with a love they couldn't imprison or torture. I ended the video declaring that I, Abdul Hussein, once a hunter of Christians, was now a follower of the Lamb. When the studio lights went out, I knew there was no going back. I had cast my voice over Iran like a seed of hope, and now my life was entirely in God's hands, no longer in the hands of men. The video was released on a Friday morning, and what happened in the hours following was something that defied any logic I knew about communication and intelligence. In less than 6 hours, the counter read 500,000 views, and by the next day, the number had passed 2 million. spreading like wildfire through every social network and messaging app inside Iran. I watched it from my small apartment in Germany, feeling a mix of terror and an indescribable awe, seeing my face and voice occupy the space the regime always tried to control with an iron fist. The state's response was not long in coming. Press TV and other official channels began airing segments calling me a traitor, a CIA agent, and someone mentally unstable who had been bribed to lie. Seeing photos from my time in the IRGC being used to accuse me of treason was a shock, but inside I felt a strange peace, a certainty that the system I once served was terrified because it couldn't contain the truth I was spreading. They could block sites and take down profiles, but the seed had already flown far from their hands. The most painful moment, however, was when I saw my father on national television. Ayatollah Mohammad Hussein appeared in front of our house in Qom, surrounded by reporters and government officials, with a face that looked carved in cold stone. With a voice that carried no trace of affection, he declared that I was dead to the family, that I had brought unbearable shame to our name, and that he was disowning me before all the people and Allah. Watching my own father erase me from existence was like feeling a blade cutting what remained of my old identity, a pain no physical torture could ever match. I cried until I had no more tears, sitting on the floor of that German living room, feeling the weight of absolute isolation from everything I loved in my homeland. But in the midst of that sharp silence, the voice I heard in my room in Isfahan returned to whisper in my spirit, "You are my beloved son." The earthly father had closed the door and cast me into darkness, but the eternal Father was holding me with a strength no fatwa or human decree could break. I had lost a last name, but gained an eternal lineage. Then, the messages began to arrive from every corner of Iran, turning my mourning into a sense of purpose I never imagined having. There were thousands of emails and comments from people saying they had seen the man in white in their dreams, that they had felt the same overwhelming love, and that now, hearing my account, they had confirmation that they weren't going crazy. I read messages from youth in Tehran, mothers in Tabriz, and even ex-members of the Basij militia, all reporting the same supernatural invasion of Jesus into their rooms and lives. I realized I was just a small part of a giant wave breaking over Iran, a movement of the Holy Spirit that ignored borders, censorship, and prisons. The regime I served dedicated millions of dollars to hunting Christians, but Jesus was doing the work of evangelism on his own, appearing directly to those who had never seen a Bible. Seeing my testimony become a meeting point for this invisible church was the greatest prize I could receive. I had been used as a bridge for thousands of hearts thirsty for the same peace that reached me that early morning. Today, I live in Heidelberg, helping other refugees who arrive with the same marks of dust and fear I brought. But the truth is, I still can't explain everything that happened. Sometimes I wake up at exactly 3:47 a.m. and look at the corner of my room, hoping to see that glow again, but the physical light is gone, leaving only the permanent mark on my soul. People ask me for a logical explanation, a psychological theory about what I experienced, but I have nothing but my own scar and the peace that defies understanding. The experience simply happened, without warning, and ceased with the same intensity, leaving me with a total inability to translate into human words the greatness of that face and the weight of that voice in Farsi. I am an intelligence officer who was defeated by a love that uses no weapons, a disowned son who was adopted by a king, and a man who carries the mystery of having been touched by the eternal. There is no going back for who I was, and the why of it all remains the deepest secret of my existence, a mystery that is enough for me until my last breath.
The story of Abdul Hussein is proof that there are no locked doors for the Holy Spirit. What if today was the day Jesus called your name? Would you be ready to leave everything behind for this love? Share your opinion or your own experience here in the comments. Your voice is fundamental to our community. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. This is very important to ensure you don't miss the next transformative content we are preparing. Don't leave without watching the next video appearing on your screen now. It will go even deeper into what God is doing in these times. Until the next video, God bless you.